on October 16th, we had the privilege of screening Sharon Yamato's powerful film on attorney Wayne Collins and the Tule Lake Segregation Center called One Fighting Irishman. Before our panel discussion that evening, I briefly amplified on a few of the legal threads which are raised in the film. I'm no lawyer. I'm a writer and public historian. What I want to do is move us away from thinking of loyalty and disloyalty as absolutes, as a binary yes, yes, or no, no, by drilling down into the three adverse actions the government takes at Tule Lake as seen in the film. The segregation to Tule Lake as an unexpected consequence of the loyalty questionnaire, the Denaturalization Act of 1944, and the trap of voluntary renunciation, and the prison gangs that form under the duress of living in what is effectively a high-security prison camp. To illustrate these points, I'll draw from my two recent works, this graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse. Panels from this book are now exhibited in the gallery of the Kennedy Learning Center in the Matsui Courthouse, and they pertain to the Supreme Court challenge of Mitsuya Endo of Sacramento. She's just one of three characters in the book. For the panel, we're concerned about this fellow in the film, Hiroshi Kashiwagi, also from Sacramento. I've also centered writings from Tule Lake in this new anthology for Penguin Classics, the literature of Japanese American incarceration. So first, the loyalty questionnaire. You've seen in Sharon's film how everyone was forced into camp with no individual hearings or trials. Now, this massive denial of due process only becomes a problem for the government 10 months later, when two agencies realize they need to retroactively determine individual loyalties. Many young Nisei men wanted a way to prove they are just as American as everyone else by volunteering for the army in the fight against fascism. But the army, having effectively branded all Japanese in America as untrustworthy by the very fact of publicly locking them up, now needs a reverse PR campaign to clear volunteers as eligible for service. By the same token, the Civilian War Relocation Authority, their mission is to eventually relocate families into homes and jobs in the East and Midwest. And it too needs some way to cleanse them for resettlement. They come up with what for them is the perfect paper trail, a loyalty oath. Let the people in camp tell us who they are loyal to. The Army and WRA combine their questions onto one form. And as you see in the film, the last two questions feel like trick questions. And the timing is all wrong. Tokyo Yamane, whom you saw in the film, says, look, if you ask me these questions before taking everything away from me and treating me like the enemy, which I'm not, then I'll be happy to answer yes. But now you're asking me to affirm my loyalty to this country after you've arrested 5,500 immigrant community leaders and separated them from their families, and after you've denied due process and individual hearings to 125,000 others. So the answers are tainted by anger and frustration and by rage. Hiroshi Kashiwagi has committed no overt acts of disloyalty to the government. His attitude is, I'm sick of saying yes to everything. And he says, I'll prove my loyalty by standing for my rights as an American. And really, how effective is a paper questionnaire as a means of rooting out potential spies or saboteurs in any given group? If I were a Japanese sleeper agent sent by Tokyo years before World War II to burrow into the West Coast, would I suddenly now give myself up with an answer on a paper questionnaire? Would I be saying, oh, you got me, fair and square, I confess? I don't think so. Further aggravating the situation is the fact that no one, not even the camp administration, knows the consequences of a yes or no answer. All the bureaucracy knows to do is to take all these forms and sort them into two piles, yes and no. And the binary nature of these questions, the binary yes-no nature of registration, effectively creates an administrative class of people who must be designated on paper as not loyal for failing to answer a straight yes. Now, in most texts and museums, this is the chapter usually politely called a question of loyalty, as if it were a simple question upon which one could be judged. So in the graphic novel, we reject that framing, as you see here, because it places the onus on incarcerees. We flip it on its head. Again, as Toko Yamada says, at the time, it's not a question of my loyalty, it's the country that's not loyal to us, to its own principles, not loyal to the Constitution. So, it is the government, you see, that creates a class of disloyals, not the incarcerees, through a purely bureaucratic act. Disloyalty on paper, not by action. And under the law, you can't be prosecuted for your thoughts, only for your actions. So officials are taken by surprise when 1 in 5 Nisei in camp either refuses to answer or qualifies their answer or answers no. Congress is so disappointed in what's seen as the failure of the loyalty registration, it passes a resolution to demand the WRA separate the no's from the yeses as a threat to this nation. And as you heard Greg Robinson say in the film, Mike Masaoka of the JACL privately urges segregation, with JACL leaders getting famously beaten up in camp, Fred Tayama at Manzanar, National President Saburo Kido at Poston. And in the anthology, the Penguin Anthology, we excerpt this confidential statement that Masaoka writes to Dylan Meyer, so you can read for yourself how Masaoka now equates protest and dissent in camp with disloyalty to the government. And he pledges, quote, most of our chapter leaders have signified their willingness to name those whom they consider inimical to center welfare, if their own names are not revealed. So, WRA director designates Tule Lake as his segregation center and appoints a new Get Tough project director, Raymond Best, who fortifies the camp with 22 more watchtowers, an 8-foot-high double man-proof fence, and a battalion of military police at the ready. This is what makes Tule Lake unique among all 10 camps. And now we see that this is the consequence of that answer you put down on paper during registration a year before. WRA moves out 6,000 from Tule Lake who answer yes, and moves in 12,000 from the other 9 camps. MPs fingerprint the new arrivals and take their mugshots. And as you've seen in the film, this sets the stage for mass protests, beatings, martial law, and creation of the Tule Lake Stockade. Now, all through the war, those same elected officials in Congress have been looking for some legal means to strip the American-born Japanese of their birthright citizenship and deport everyone, both Issei and Nisei, to Japan. Attorney General Francis Biddle tells them, you really can't do that under the 14th Amendment. But he does show them a way to work around the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship. He says, look, you could pass a law giving the Nisei the chance to voluntarily renounce their citizenship during times of war. And in July 1944, Congress passes the Denaturalization Act. And as I said earlier, many saw through the loyalty questionnaire in 1943 as a trick. But in our anthology, we reprint this 1944 law that sets another trap. And 5,000 people at Tule Lake walk right into it, including Hiroshi Kashiwagi. And this is the mess that you see Wayne Collins spend the next 10 years helping people untangle in the film. Now, by this point, the resegregants can see how their government has turned its back on them, abandoned them, even tricking them into surrendering the one thing that made them Americans. At Tule Lake, they can see that they are a people who've been left with nothing but the skin on their backs, their race. Everything before has led to this. Forced removal, incarceration, segregation led to this, the single most misunderstood and maligned consequence of the entire incarceration experience, the Hokkoku Hoshidan, or volunteers for the immediate return to the homeland. The Hoshidan rallies the people to train themselves for a new life in Japan, not the real nation devastated by war, but a phantom, idealized promised land where they believe they'll be treated with dignity once again. And in the film, we see the story through the eyes of Hiroshi Kashiwagi, and we hear the intimidation he felt from the Hoshidan. And there are scraps of folklore in many families of how, Grandpa was beaten up by someone who really was pro-Japan. But that's half the story. When you view it through the eyes of Tamakashi, who was decorated after the war, by the way, for his army service in Korea and Vietnam, you get a different view in his self-published memoir, Betrayed Trust, which we excerpt in the anthology. Akashi provides a rare insider's account, in English, of teenagers like himself who wear the hachimaki headbands and rising sun sweatshirts and blow their bugles, not as threats, but as what he calls badges of honor. He shows their sweatshirts and bugles to be ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog, and the menacing-looking marches to be little more than prison calisthenics that wake up a lot of surly people at 5 a.m., and their fervor for the emperor and the study of the Japanese language to be acts of cultural affinity more than political action, personal pride in the only thing the government has left them. Again, the skin on their backs, their race. From Akashi, we get this key line. For the first time, I feel good about being Japanese, not in a political or loyalty sense, but being part of the Japanese race. And you realize that, parading around with bugles, headbands in the middle of the high desert of California does not equate to disloyalty to America, not when it's America that has stripped them of everything and segregated them into a prison camp. And, they're in the middle of nowhere. What are they going to do, for heaven's sake? And the gang pressure, while unfortunate, is just the kind of gangs that turn on inmates in any kind of prison. Nothing more sinister than that. So I will end my presentation here and will proceed to the panel discussion that followed on October 16th with filmmaker Sharon Yamato and moderator Sacramento Superior Court Judge Kara Ueda and myself. Due to a technical issue with the live recording, you will now hear only the audio portion. You'll hear the audio portion of that discussion with the video restored in about 10 minutes from now. So with that, thank you very much. Two things, though, I want to say that one, we have a rich archive of video oral histories online that Densho in Seattle has captured. Go to Densho, DENSHO.org, and you will find a online database of hundreds of interviews with our grandparents' generation, talking about their stories from camp, much like Steven Spielberg's Show Up Foundation project, talking to Holocaust survivors. So their voices are still with us. The other is that to talk about my literary anthology, we have the writers and we have the documents. And so, this is where I work from as well, is that we have fiction writers and letters, diaries, memoirs that were written in camp and after camp of people who were both, promoting loyalty at Tule Lake, and those like Hiroshi Kashiwagi are talking about their struggles. So those people wrote those stories, diaries, letters, because they wanted their experience to be remembered. And so I'm glad that we could, do this anthology to help bring their voices back out into a publication that frames the history in a way that is fresh and new.
And Sharon, I'm going to ask the question that I think a lot of people probably wonder, which is about George Takei. Yes. And if you could talk a little bit about not only, I think, what it's like actually sort of working with him, but also maybe comment on the fact that, his family was, I don't know, maybe not that unique in that he had one parent who was a U.S. citizen, right, who had given up her United States citizenship. And then he had a father who was not a U.S. citizen. And so it potentially left, I think, both of them as stateless. And then if in fact they had gone back to Japan, Star Trek might have been a totally different show, yes, right? And you might also not have had, kind of a person to narrate this overall story for you.
Well, the interesting, so the reason that I approached him to even take this on is because he actually says, before I knew about Wayne Collins, that Wayne Collins was one of the three most influential people in his life. And the others were Gene Roddenberry, and the third was his father. So that's how important Wayne Collins was to him. And he absolutely, like you said, that he would not, Star Trek would not be Star Trek without George. But and so he owes a great deal. And I think that came through in his work with me on this project. He was so responsive, so cooperative, so helpful. He really wanted that loyalty questionnaire to be spelled out because it was that important to him. I mean, even I provided the script. He changed some of the wording to make it stronger because he really felt that he needed people to know that it was, kind of a travesty. He thought that, and he wanted people to know that. But the other thing though about George that is interesting is that he was a child during camp. So the work that he's doing now is really as someone who's done a lot of research on camp. A lot of the things that he is, he's doing a lot of work. Thank God for him, because, it's not a mainstream topic. The World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans is not something that everybody, sees in the news or talks about, but he's making it his personal project. He's in a Broadway play. He's done several books. He really wants people to know about it. And that's from the perspective of being a child in camp, which is, I think, interesting because factually, he's had to do all his own homework on the subject. So,
Sharon, didn't you also that his father's affidavit about being beaten up and hospitalized in camp? Didn't you actually spring that on him that day?
It was the day before we shot that, where he talks about the affidavit. He had never seen his mother's affidavit, which I found astounding because he's done a lot of work. So we managed to find it. I thought that was really important. Show it to him. That morning, he called me and said, I'm really devastated and very emotional about this. And so that it came through, I think, that, that was not George Takei, the actor. He was really visibly shaken by being confronted with this paragraph about his father being beaten. He had no idea about it. I mean, he brags about his father talking about camp a lot, but he did not have any idea that that had happened. So yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. It was really pretty.
Yeah, it comes through.
Yeah,
and special.
And I appreciate the fact that sometimes we think in terms of George being an actor, but this, I think, was George being, a son and a person that just like, not the actor George Takei.
Yeah, so my understanding is that Wayne Collins took on this case, which was very large because he represented thousands of Japanese Americans who had given up their citizenship. And the case that is kind of the case that's known as is Abo versus Clark. Abo because it was A, right? Yeah. See, if you're at the end of the alphabet.
Yeah, right.
Anything. Yeah. So it was Abo versus Clark. And it was him by himself, right? And this was before email and fax machines and all that. And he somehow had to gather affidavits from a number of people to file on behalf of all of them. Did you get a sense at all as to how that all worked and how he managed to do all that?
His records are at the Bancroft Library. The files are voluminous. I mean, we're not just talking one pleading. We're talking multiple pleadings for this one case. In fact, it was 3 cases, separate cases. And this, again, I'm not a lawyer, but one was a habeas corpus case. One was another, trying to keep them from being deported. So there was that going on. And then subsequent to that, it was like a huge number. I would say he probably filed appeals. It was, I don't know, 20, 30 different, pleadings, probably more. But, it got so bad that when I was doing research during COVID, and I thought, this is way too much. I don't think I can handle all of this, reading all these pleadings. But, he actually, Tex Nakamura, who's in the film, was his right-hand person. So I think credit goes to Tex Nakamura because he was at Tule Lake. He was the legal representative at Tule Lake, and he's the one who enlisted Collins. And he did a lot of the footwork for Collins in this case. So he really deserves a lot of attention as well. And I think you're right in terms of the amount of work that it took. It really kind of is staggering. It's staggering. I mean, he had assistants. Most of his assistants were Japanese Americans. They were women who, his number one assistant, I'm really sorry we didn't include her in the film, but again, it was 30 minutes, so I couldn't include everyone. She was really critical. Her name was Chio Wada. She's from the Bay Area. Anyway, he had assistants that did a lot of the paperwork, but when this whole thing started and he realized that the Justice Department had filed an appeal and said, you have to give an individual reason for each person renouncing. He was willing to file individual lawsuits for each one of them. That was his course of action. And you must know how long that would have taken. 4,000 lawsuits before, and he was willing to do that, and he fought for that. And that's how they came up with this idea of the affidavit, because in that way, it was just paperwork that he had to file. Everybody had to fill out this affidavit and specifically say why you renounced. And some of them, as we try to say in the film, the government looked at it and said, no, that's not a good reason. So they had to refile it. And so there's some, and we can talk about this, there's some controversy over the affidavits because he told these people, you have to give the government reasons for your renunciation. So how much his influence on these affidavits is a little, unclear, because he was not writing them. He was reading them. And then if the government denied them, he'd give them back and say, I think you have to say this, this, and this. You have to be way more specific. You have to tell about specific beatings. You have to make sure that they understand that there was a reason that you renounced. So it's a lot of work.
So what Sharon's suggesting is that the mythology we get around Tule Lake of pro-Japan gangs and of beatings at Tule Lake and gang pressure, while certainly a factual, may have been the result of a legal strategy on Wayne Collins' behalf as a legal advocate for his clients who were seeking to withdraw their renunciations. That if, claiming or asserting or exaggerating that, I was pressured into it by these mean people, would be the factual fact pattern that would give the Justice Department to look favorably on it. That's something that people are looking at right now as a possibility.
But I would say, and because I've read through a lot of the affidavits myself, they were not written by Wayne Collins. They were definitely written by people he did not actually write those, but he did in certain cases have to ask them to be more specific, because that was one of the factors that led to their being accepted by the government. And part of the thing was you had to take into consideration that this happened over a long 10-year period of time, 20-year period of time. Was 1968 was his last lawsuit in the case. But at the same time, the political climate was such that things were changing, because right after the war, the government was really adamant that they wanted to deport these people. They wanted to, because they were dangerous, right? As times got further away from the whole post-war scene, they became a little more lenient. So there was a change, there was a shift, as time went by. So, but certainly the ones who he originally filed for, they really, had to make sure that they had to prove without a doubt. Because I've seen some of the ones that they denied, and they were, they were pretty. I would have not denied them, but the government was really adamant at the time.
But going back to the beatings, though, there's a Sacramento resident named Barbara Takei of Tule Lake Committee who has made an effort to count up the number of documented beatings at Tule Lake, and found a number of them were due to marital squabbles, gambling disputes, and just marital. His wife is cheating on him, so he beats up the guy. What's the word for that?
Domestic violence.
Yeah, domestic violence. Thank you. And so I think that there's still a question as to how much the legal strategy may have influenced the content of these affidavits.
There's also a question, there's also work been done by Japanese who actually went back to Japan, and they're saying, oh no, there wasn't any kind of, coercion at Tule Lake. There, we never felt that kind of coercion. So there's
In our policy, the function I would say, why would we want to pressure people to join us who were not true believers? We only wanted people who would believe in our cause of repatriation, and we don't want outside troublemakers. Yeah. So it's very complex.
There's
very
like,
complex.
yeah, it's very ambiguous. I mean, there's a lot of like different ways you can see it. There's no clear cut, especially that's why I think the digging should continue, because there's a lot of digging that still needs to be done. And I hope people, scholars do it. I think we're really touching the surface.
Yeah.
And I really feel that there's so much at this one camp that was so different from all the rest that we really need to dig deeper into it.
When you have prisons, you have prison gangs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Do either of you have a sense about the Hoshidan in terms of like, was there a lot of sort of pressure within the camp to become a member, or how did it get started? Do you have any idea as to that history?
Well, my sense is that, first of all, they were very young. So we're talking about 17, 18-year-olds. And, they tend to go along with their pals, right? So there's that chumminess of, you're going to join the, of course, I'd like to join too. It's typical gang behavior.
Or the boy, it's like joining the Boy Scouts.
Exactly.
It's like, you want to have a club you belong to.
You want to be with your friends, right?
Yeah.
So, and I hate to say this, but young people tend to be more easily influenced because it's like a friendship thing, right? You're wanting to do what the other people are doing. So the youth had a lot to do with the formation of the Hoshidan. There were, that was a young men's organization. So, and I mean, you talk to some of the people like in the interviews we did, they kind of laughed. That was kind of me when I was a young kid. And, we just did what everybody else did. And there was definitely that going on. But then there were the serious ones too that are, that were dedicated to, showing their loyalty to Japan. They were, really pro culture. We want to further our culture. And I think that was a factor, but they tended to be, the leaders of.
Barbara Takei calls them more like the Black Panthers of the 60s. Just a group that was somewhat a yellow nationalistic organization for the good of the people. Panthers.
And it's very interesting because when you have Tule Lake, then you have this situation where, for those of you who may not know, camps were surrounded by barbed wire, right? There were guns pointing in to the camp, and then there was the Hoshidan, and then there were questions of, renunciation, and then there was the loyalty questionnaire with the 27 and 28 questions on them. And I can just see that it'd be very confusing, right, to be asked these questions or to ask to give up your citizenship. And then I think that the issue that ultimately drove the renunciation to be effectively set aside was that there was a finding that they did not voluntarily give up their citizenship because they were under all these different constraints, right? It was under duress, wasn't freely and voluntarily made. And I think Wayne Collins was perhaps lucky to have the judge that they got, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you do a lot of research on, it was Goodman, I believe,
yes,
the Northern District?
Goodman. Yes, yes, exactly. And what he knew going in was that Goodman had also
acquitted the Tule Lake draft resistor.
Exactly. So the draft resistor expert here knows that Goodman was very, in all the camps of draft resistors.
Were convicted of draft evasion and spent 2 years in federal prison. And Louis Goodman in Eureka, California,
right.
Waited until the last day of the 6-day trial to acquit the Tule Lake draft resistors, and then had the car idling in the back with his bailiff. Because this is Eureka, right? This is a red state back then, still is. And he issued his ruling acquitting these Japanese draft dodgers, who resisted the draft, and then they jumped in the car and drove away back to San Francisco. They're a visiting judge.
Yeah, he took an active role in that. Didn't he also have the the attorney, the defense attorney on that case, it was someone he knew, he enlisted.
Yeah,
someone.
a friend
because-
to defend the two. Like,
Right, exactly. So because the person who was appointed apparently was not doing the job he felt.
He hated
needed
Japanese, yeah.
to be done. The issue with Goodman, and again, it gets into the complicated process that led to the fact that Al Weirin with the Southern California ACLU filed this suit on behalf of 3 women, where Collins was filing the suit on behalf of thousands, it was a mass suit. So, but the issue I think was that I think he felt that he was going to get a good result from Goodman because he knew Goodman. So when he got his result from Goodman Goodman said, yes, you can't deport them. They're not, and then he ended up being overturned by the Southern California ACLU because the 3 women were being represented in Southern California and his suit was in Northern California. So the Justice Department decided we're going to appeal the whole Collins decision based on the fact that these 3 women were given specific, they were judged to be under duress specifically, whereas his suit was for this mass number of people. And I think with Weirin, what he was trying to do, and again, who knows, but what he was trying to do was find surefire cases. These 3 women were really suffering duress. And Collins said, everybody suffering duress, they're in a camp, right? So he was, and Weirin, I think there was some like, oh no, that's not going to happen. They're never going to pass. They're never going to let 5,000 people free, or it was actually 1,000 people at the time. So it was a very complicated procedure. And sadly, Collins would blame in subsequent years, Al Weirin and he was a Heart Mountain Resistor attorney. Yeah. And there was a big falling out between
Weirin
the
screwed
two
him
of them.
over. He totally screwed him over. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a real big falling out. So it's interesting how the legal cases can be, can turn on each other and cause more problems. So that was a big mess for Collins, but he, again, the guy, he really fought it. He really did whatever he could to fight it. So.
Did you want to take questions?
Yes, I think now might be a great time to turn to some questions from the audience. Thank you for this wonderful dialogue so far with this very expert moderation. And so now we're going to have some time for some questions from the audience. And I think they can probably be about any aspect of the works that you've seen or the history. I know that our panelists are able to answer all sorts of things. So they could be questions from a creative sense or from a historical sense, I'm sure. So just raise your hand and I will call on you. It's a small enough room that what we're going to do is you can say your question and then I will repeat the question so that it's loud enough for everybody. So feel free to just, don't be shy. This is why we have these wonderful panelists here. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. So in the far back there.
Hi, I'm pretty loud, so I think everyone can.
I'm going to repeat it though because of Zoom.
Oh,
so
okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So it's a 2-part question about the legacy of Tule Lake. First part, how did old Tulians feel about the people coming into camp during, after, and today?
So the first question I'm going to say, how do old Tulians, is that what
So those who
feel about people coming into camp? Before-
once it became the segregation camp.
Okay, understood. Once it became the segregation camp, others coming into the camp. And the other question?
And then for those who renounced, did they struggle at all with receiving redress in the 80s and 90s?
So, and for those who renounced, did they struggle receiving any redress in the 80s and?
So I think that was one of the big mistakes that the administration made, was by bringing in people who had professed that they were, they had signed no to the loyalty questionnaire, while keeping the people who still were at Tule Lake who signed yes. And so immediately, I think the conflict was set up. I mean, it was clear. But I can, there's part of me that kind of understands it, because I think in a lot of ways, the War Relocation Authority was trying to be very beneficent. And so when people said, no, I don't want to move again, I'm at Tule Lake, I don't want to move again, they said, okay. So they let these people stay in probably the nicest barracks. They were the ones that were settled there. And they brought in these people who had to move another time, who were already a little angry at the government for making them sign this loyalty questionnaire. And there was immediate conflict. I think I know Hiroshi Kashiwagi talks about it. All through the period of segregation, there was a group called the resegregationists, and their goal was to separate the camp so that there were people who had professed loyalty to Japan in one area, and the people who were the ones who had already been there, who were not they were not wanting to go back to Japan in another area, and they couldn't do that either. So that, I mean, it's ineptitude. I don't know. That was kind of it was too bad that they couldn't figure out a way to do that, to separate the people, at least within the camp, because it was already a done deal that they were there together. So.
Answer your second part of your question about whether renunciants at Tule Lake had any trouble getting redress in 1988. I'm not aware. I was there, and I think in the end there was no discussion about denying people because of their status as renunciants or not. I mean, I should say being segregees at Tule Lake. But I think that it's important that in a graphic novel, the JCL in 1946 had a national convention, and they had a discussion about the Tule Lake renunciants and segregees, and some still nursed a grudge over being taunted and threatened for their unwavering loyalty. So in the Pacific Citizen, there was a talk about a resolution that if those renunciants hated America so much, JCL should go on record in favor of their immediate deportation, and if they're allowed to stay, they should have to carry identification cards to show that they were at Tule Lake. And Mike Masaoka is on the record as having a little bit of wisdom in a sense. He says, hold on, folks. If we require Tulians to show a special ID, we who are not at Tule Lake, we can also be asked to carry ID to show that we're not at Tule Lake. So it's a double-edged sword. But you saw one of the interviewees said, JCL didn't want to sully their hands with the deportees after the war. The redress was in Congress and in the administration of the redress. The distinction was no descendants. Like I'm a descendant. I was born in 1951. So only the people who were in camp were actual, we call out survivors, but people who are actually in the camps would be the only ones who should be awarded a token compensation. And also, I think those who voluntarily relocated before the exclusion orders also were deemed eligible. So the question is, whether those who expatriated to Japan, I am not sure. I'm sure there was a vehement discussion about that. I mean, you can be sure that there were discussions, probably in Congress too, that we're not going to be sending checks to Tokyo for redress reparations. And I'm not off the top of my head certain which way that discussion landed.
Thank you for that really interesting question. Who else has a question?
I have two questions. So one is, my father was a renunciant. Are those affidavits available someplace online, or how do I find those things?
So the question is from a gentleman who said his father was a renunciant, and he's wondering if the affidavits are available online or someplace where they can be viewed.
They are at the National Archives. The bulk of them are in Northern California at the, what's the archive? It's a unit of the archive right next to the San Bruno. It's impossible. You have to really go through them because I don't think they're cataloged. the person who I got them from actually went to the archives and photographed each one. So I have not all of them. So I have a good bulk of them that he photographed, but it does.
So if you give us your, after, see us
Exactly.
afterwards, give us
Yeah.
your name,
Yeah.
or your father's name, and we'll talk to Hiroshi.
Yeah, in
And-
fact,
and, yeah.
I could look it up too, maybe in my, I have a lot.
Back channel link,
So, yeah.
And your second question?
Probably to Frank.
Hmm.
So I'm involved in this documentary called Road Drift. It's about Yoshi Fugo out of Merced, who was a draft resistor, spent a couple years in prison. They got his farm back. But part of that is he, as a result of being in prison, he decided, he renounced. Then he decided that was a bad idea. So he wrote a letter saying, can I take it back?
Yes.
And then apparently the government wrote a letter saying, we never accepted it in the first place. So you're talking about, so I'm wondering how between that case and, what happened to the people at Tule Lake, if you're aware of that.
So an interesting question about someone who did renounce, but then wrote to the government to say, actually, I didn't mean it. Can I take that back? And the government saying, we never accepted that in the first place, and what the difference was.
Oh, it's hard to know because of the special circumstances that this person was in. I think the thing to keep in mind, though, is that American government had never before, incarcerated its own citizens en masse before. And so the government officials were making this stuff up as they went along. And things happen, and things fall through, the paperwork is lost. Individual administrators make different decisions. It can be kind of random at times. So who knows?
I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a question myself. And first, I want to recognize that I think we have a whole bunch of young people here who are earning your civics badge. Is that right? Citizenship badge. Very cool. Which troop are you representing? We're giving me some there. Say it again. Which troop? Troop 454. Wonderful. So related to that, I thought that I would like to hear a little reflection from Sharon and Frank. This is a big question, take it however you want, but with all of this work that you have done, what is the message that you would like to give to young folks learning about this, about the meaning of citizenship, the meaning of individual truth and justice, however you want to take it? I would love to hear what all of this extraordinary work, your reflections are, how you would share that. Sharon, do you want to start?
No. It's a really, really good question. And, one of the biggest problems with this whole idea of incarceration was we were American citizens when it happened. So the government did a study and the result was, it was purely a result of racism and mass hysteria. So to say that someone is not patriotic or not a citizen because they're of a different race is really the root of the problem. And that's why Japanese Americans were incarcerated. And sadly, it could easily happen again because of the fact that there's racism still exists in this country. And we like to separate people by their race and say immigrants are not patriotic because they weren't, their parents weren't born here. So the idea of citizenship is important, but it's also, how you feel as a citizen. And that's one thing that the Japanese Americans most would say. And that's the reason that they formed this 442nd, military group to die for their country, because they wanted to show people that they were patriotic and that they were loyal Americans. And to have to go to that length to show that is really it's a stain on our society, that citizenship has to be proven, because if you're not an immigrant or not born here, or who had parents who weren't born here, or who have a face that's different from other people, a different color than other people. So, I mourn the fact that racism still exists in this country. And hopefully, we can do something, especially you guys, to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen again.
I have nothing more to add, except to, to recognize that you are, by the fact that you're born here in America, you are a citizen. So you have that privilege, and recognize that other countries are founded on racial or ethnic groups. And so the idea of birthright citizenship is what makes America unique. And I would encourage you to stand in defense of others who you see targeted because of their differences, whether it's the differences based on their race or their religion or their immigration status or their gender identity or their sexual orientation, because those are the things that are targeted whenever people want to divide people based on fear. And fear is what drove the wartime incarceration that we're talking about.
I'm going to turn it over to Judge Ueda for one concluding question. If you have one concluding question.
Oh, if I have one concluding
Yes,
question
you
for
have one
them.
concluding
Oh, I thought you were going to
question
ask
for
me.
them.
I didn't think it wasn't going to be as big of a question.
Yeah.
I actually don't have one concluding question, but I didn't know if they wanted to add any final remarks about anything that they didn't have to say or anything that you would like to share. Like, how did you get those audio tapes of Wayne Collins that sounded so clear, or, anything else that you might want to add?
I love that you ask questions that I can answer. I know how he got the audio tapes. It's actually someone who is still alive today. He spent a week with Wayne Collins. What I guess I would kind of like to close with the message of the film, and that is that one person can make a difference. And it's hard to imagine that one person can make a difference, but I think one person, and so that's why we all have to, take an active role in our citizenship or our work, what we do, what we tell others. I think I like to set him up as an example of that. I mean, I don't think we all have to work as hard as he did, but the fact that he was able to do it really says a lot about our country and, who we are and who we stand for, what we stand for.
I would just say that, I mentioned the fear of the other is what drove the wartime incarceration, and that the study of this incarceration is important because we continue to see cycles of the same kinds of fears throughout the post-war years. I think that in the 1980s, we saw imports of Japanese cars and consumer electronics that led to fears of an economic Pearl Harbor. And you saw Toyotas and Datsuns being bashed by Detroit auto workers, and a fellow named Vincent Chin in Detroit clubbed to death by two Detroit auto workers because of fear of the other. After 9/11, suicide attacks, World Trade Center, we saw calls for the internment, roundup of Iranian Americans, Arab Americans, and anyone who wore a turban. And as recently as the election of 2016, we see calls for travel bans of travel from majority Muslim nations. We saw family separations on the southern border and from asylum seekers, and we saw the caging of kids. And even during the pandemic, we had a president who blamed it all on a China virus and Kung flu. So these are all examples of, America turning on, in this case, Asian Americans, who just, you can pick them out because they look different or they sound different. And so I encourage you all to be aware of this and the study until we resolve the cycle of fear and othering. This kind of thing will continue to this day.
Well, I don't think you can end on better takeaway messages than that. So let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much on behalf of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, and I think I can speak for the FBA of Sacramento and the Asian Pacific Bar Association of Sacramento. We appreciate everyone who has come, and we so appreciate our panelists and moderator. And now we would like to invite you all to come out to the beautiful rotunda of the Matsui Courthouse to enjoy the reception. And for everyone who joined us via Zoom, we so appreciate your participating tonight as well. Thanks very much.